ESPN ranked all the NFL rosters as they're currently constructed going into the training camp season of the NFL. I'll talk about where the Steelers are ranked, the strengths and weaknesses ESPN said, and also my commentary on why the Steelers could do better or worse than that ranking. I'm your host, Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And we're going to start today's show off, first of all, saying hope everyone enjoyed their 4th of July. But let's get into where I want to talk about today, and that's a list that was released late last week by ESPN, and it was a complete ranking of all the NFL rosters out there, 1 to 32, and where the Steelers fell. Spoiler alert, you can go read this, by the way, on ESPN.com. It's behind a paywall with their NFL Insider, but because I pay for that with my ESPN subscription, figure we could talk about this here on the show, because there were some interesting things here as far as where the Steelers were ranked and comparing them to other rosters that I thought would be worth talking about on the show. The Steelers were ranked 14th as a roster in the NFL. And if you think 14th, it's like, okay, out of all the 32 teams, that's not bad. It's not a bad situation. But you look at the entire AFC, they were the 10th ranked AFC roster on this list, which again goes to the point that everyone's been making all real offseason long, is that the AFC could be very hotly contested, and it might be a bit of a dogfight to get into a wild card spot, even if you're having a 10-win season or so, which here or there, we'll see as time goes. There's always teams that aren't as good as people thought they were, and teams that aren't as bad as they thought they were. But let's get into why the Steelers were ranked at 14th. Now, for every team, ESPN did 4 segments. They did the strongest unit, the weakest unit, the X factor for the team, and the non-starter to know. And then they would tell you their projected starters there as well. The strongest unit, pretty obviously, was TJ Watt, and the edge rushers, their pass rushers, just across the board. Him, Alex Highsmith, and then going and getting Marcus Golden and DeMarvin Leal being a flex there, with Herbig being a guy who can come in and bring in depth. That's a solid position that they're in. You and I all know that is the bread and butter of this Steelers team. That if that group eats, this team is a lot better off. But the weakest unit is something we've talked about day in and day out on this show, and it's the off-ball linebacker position, mainly because we don't know what it's going to look like with Cole Holcomb and Landon Roberts as your 1-2 punch, and then you throw in Tanner Muse and Mark Robinson behind them, and it's not an easy picture to see how it's going to play out with when teams start trying to go at those guys as cover linebackers. But again, that's why we've emphasized several times on the show why the Steelers should be looking there in free agency, who they could trade for to kind of get a cover linebacker that could fit with the group as it stands now. So that makes sense. The X factor for the team, though, and this kind of dips into what I'm going to talk a lot more in depth about in the next segment, but it's the X factor is George Pickens, because of his ability to go up and get the football, even in contested situations as a rookie, with a rookie quarterback throwing the ball to him, is a huge chance for a lot of upside as he grows in his second year in the NFL. And I think that George Pickens isn't alone here. And this is where when we start talking about the projected starters and how this roster is comprised, this is where I think the Steelers could easily rise this year from this projection being right now at 14th to maybe even getting into the top 10 as far as rosters by the end of the season, because I think there's so many young players who stand a really strong chance to grow this year into even being stronger players. And then the non-starter to know that they listed was Nick Herbig, the 4th-round draft pick out of Wisconsin, because he showed good pressure rates in college, and he could be a guy coming off the bench that even you don't even need him necessarily to be a key contributor because you have Watt, you have Highsmith, and then you sign Marcus Golden, and DeMarvin Leal's also been flexed out there a few times. But if he came on, it means that you would just have a full just rotation to be able to throw out there at any time. And that would be super useful for the Steelers because we've seen what it's been like when they've had like guys like Cassius Marsh and Malik Reed who've come in and not been able to generate pressure consistently as backups. So those four items there are interesting, but again, look at the Steelers roster as it is right now. The strengths are the things that we know are the strengths and we know can dominate. Last year without TJ Watt was the first year in 5 seasons that the Steelers didn't lead the NFL in sacks. If TJ Watt's healthy again this year with a much improved Alex Highsmith from his rookie season 2 years ago or 3 years ago, excuse me, but when you go look at Alex Highsmith, you get Cam Hayward, you'll get a fully healthy Larry Ogunjobi. That defensive front is going to cause a lot of problems. We've talked a lot about how they have the potential to be the most dangerous defensive front in football as far as getting after the quarterback and stuffing the run this year with how physical the Steelers plan to be. Now, if that group does their job, and we've talked a lot about Minkah Fitzpatrick being one of the best safety, the best safety in football. We've talked a lot about how the secondary that works with him, Patrick Peterson, Levi Wallace, the addition of Joey Porter Jr., DeMonte KZ as your strong safety, but also Keanu Neal is sort of an extra safety that you can rotate in there. There's a lot of potential for turnovers. There's a lot of potential for good chemistry behind a strong defensive front. That group we know can work. That is not what's in question for the Pittsburgh Steelers, I truly think, in 2023. Stuffing the run with the new linebackers, that could be a question. But if they fulfill that role, if they take on that part of the job here for the Steelers, I truly think this defense will be elite. And then the question will come down to the offense. Can the offense carry the load sometimes whenever the defense has a bad day? Because all defenses have bad days. It happens to the best of them. The Steelers defense has carried them through so many wins over the past several years. When you look at 2022 and 2021, and even some parts of 2020, whenever TJ Watt and the Steelers defense was going to work, it was giving them a strong chance to win, even if they didn't put up a whole lot of points. But there's going to be a time where this offense is going to need to put up points to win games. And case in point, last year, there was if you looked back at how they played the season, you look back and you saw it. They didn't have to score a lot of points to win any of their games. And in fact, in all but there was only one win where an opponent scored 20 points. And anytime an opponent scored more than that, they lost. And on the offense, and the most points this offense even scored in a winning effort was 28 points at the end of the season. So that's where, again, it comes down to the Steelers. The thing that might be holding the Steelers back as far as roster construction is how this offense is going to look. But I think that the upside of this is that the offense is extremely young. We've talked about it a lot, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. And how it comes together is another reason why there's a lot of reason to buy in on where the Steelers are right now. We'll talk more about that here in a second on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. But before we do any of that, I want to talk to you guys about FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel Sportsbook is the #1 sportsbook in America, and they're a sponsor of this show. Take your first swing at betting on Major League Baseball on FanDuel, and you can get 10 times the amount of your first bet back in bonus bets that gets you back up to $200 back. That's right. If you bet just $20, you'll land $200 back in bonus bets, and that's win or lose on that first bet. That's $200 that you can spend on anything from the money line to the over/under to who you think is going to hit the first home run in the game that you're watching tonight. All in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We continue our talk here about ranking the Steelers roster, and I want to get into some of the other teams as well, as far as where they are. But I look at the Steelers offense, and there's a lot of potential here, not just because we still, of the fact that we don't know, or that these guys are young, but it's also because of the fact that we don't know what these guys are going to look like now that they've all kind of had time to be in the system. Kenny Pickett is the starting quarterback definitively this year. Najee Harris, you hope, doesn't go into the season with an injury. He knows how his quarterback is going to operate. This offensive line has had time to coalesce, even with, excuse me, their projected two new starters as far as Broderick Jones and Isaac Seumalo. Now, here's another thing. We've talked about this on the show. It's not a guarantee that Broderick Jones starts at left tackle because Dan Moore Jr. is just not going to give it up. And I guarantee you going into training camp, Dan Moore Jr. will be the first tackle when they start opening things up and they start giving these guys a chance to compete. But ESPN has Broderick Jones in there as the starting left tackle right away. Now, let's exclude Broderick Jones as a rookie. We'll do this. I don't even want to look at the rookies in this case. I want to look at the young veterans that they have on this roster and how they can change things around. If you look at the Steelers roster as it's constructed right now, with the age wise, and you go from oldest to youngest, there are only 10 players on this roster who are 30 or older. And a lot of them are guys that are either just fill-in backups or they're guys who know their role and are unquestionable. Like you trust them for what they do. The one guy's Patrick Peterson. He's new. He'll be 33. How he fits in. But Patrick Peterson, again, is a Hall of Fame cornerback, a future Hall of Fame cornerback. He's going to fit in fine. But guys like Cameron Hayward, Chris Boswell, those are the guys that you see there. And then there are some new guys. Allen Robinson, how does he fit at a third wide receiver? Isaac Seumalo, Marcus Golden, guys that they've just added. But those aren't the guys I think that you're having the biggest questions about as far as how good this roster can be. Now, looking again at the rosters, how it's constructed. When you look at the offense, Kenny Pickett, can he be the guy that steps up and leads the offense? It's going to be the ultimate question that we ask a million times before we see this season even begin. And then even as the season goes on, you know it, I know it. There's going to be evaluations on every game Kenny Pickett plays, from his interceptions to his touchdowns to what he doesn't do. And it will, the temperament on him will rise and fall every single week with how the Steelers finish. But I truly think when you look at here, I talked about how George Pickens was listed as the X factor by this ESPN list that was put out there. George Pickens was doing that with an offense that, again, didn't know what they really wanted to be yet, as a player who, dealt with an injury the year before and was kind of just getting into things with the Steelers. Deontay Johnson, who was still getting used to Kenny Pickett. Pat Freiermuth, who was still getting used to Kenny Pickett. And again, an offensive line that really didn't start to come together until the second half of the season. And all of that in an offense that, all criticisms for Matt Canada aside, even outside of him, just needed to figure out who it was. And we've talked about on the show and how the offense is proud to say they know who they are now. Najee Harris said that during minicamp when we talked to him at the Steelers facility, and he said, we know our identity now. There's no question about who we are and how we need to play to win football games. Whereas most of last year, that's what they were trying to figure out was, is this a ground and pound team? How do you ground and pound? What kind of blocking schemes do they like to run? How do they get the offense to get moving? And then when they need to go to the air, how do they do that to make things work? And they started to find success last year. Now it's about carrying it over. But I think that on a roster where we're talking about the majority of the playmakers on offense are young guys who just need to grow more into their role. I think that's a huge part of why I think there should be a lot of upside here. I mean, even Deontay Johnson is only 27 years old. There's a lot of space for these guys to grow. If Kenny Pickett, Najee Harris, Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, and Pat Freiermuth, those five right there, if they take steps up collectively as an offense to be better playmakers, to limit their mistakes, and to be more comfortable in a system that they were all still kind of getting used to last year, this offense becomes a lot better than just the big question mark that it is right now to a lot of people. And to me, even too, to me as well. Again, I'm not gonna lie. I'm not, I'm looking in here and I'm saying, hey, like, I always talk about when I go through uh rosters, I look at when I look at how teams are going to start. I said, where are the question marks, the guys that you don't know, where are the check marks, the guys that you do know, and like the stars that are the guys that you don't have to ever ask questions about. They're going to hold it down. And I think there's a lot less question marks this year than last year, but there's still guys who we don't know just how good they can be. We don't know how good Kenny Pickett could be. Like, I don't think we know how good any of these playmakers could be because they haven't been in an offense that's been set up in a position to succeed as much in the past couple seasons. And that's kind of where they're all coming from. Deontay Johnson being kind of the elder statesman there of that group, because he was drafted in 2019. But again, even in his years with the Steelers, 2019 was the Mason Rudolph, Devin Hodges year. 2020 was the year where, like, the first half Ben Roethlisberger was looking pretty good, and then the second half he kind of didn't. And that was the one year Deontay Johnson put up some really good numbers. 2021 was old man Ben, and 2022 was rookie Kenny Pickett. And so now you finally get a veteran Kenny Pickett that could work for Deontay Johnson. And again, you're looking at this, the Steelers, ESPN giving the Steelers this kind of respect, even with all those questions there. If the Steelers offense was to click this year, who's to say they couldn't climb even higher? And that's where I look at that's where I look at the rest of the teams here, and we'll look a little bit closer at who the teams are ahead of them. And I say, like, man, like, some of these teams, they kind of know who they are as they stand, and it's kind of, they don't have the question of how much upside will our young quarterback give to us this year, because we know because we know who he is on some of those teams, and a lot of those teams, they don't have as much as big of a young core that is growing together right now for the Steelers. And I think that that's a huge point of what the Steelers could be, not just for 2023, but for the next 7-8 years to finish out the decade. Is they need this core, and the whole core doesn't have to stick together all the time. Like, it's, there's always, there's guys that aren't going to get paid. There's the question, what will happen with Najee Harris's contract once his rookie deal's up, and things like that, and which receivers that they'll be able to keep. They'll cross that road when they get there. But if Kenny Pickett and, say, George Pickens and Freiermuth and Broderick Jones becomes a part of that after this year, Darnell Washington, maybe he steps up, you have the chance to have a special crew on offense that, if they really build chemistry this year, they could easily beat projections here and be even better than the 14th roster than in the NFL. And again, I think that's a respectable place to put them. They're just ahead of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, although they did make the playoffs last year, I think the Jaguars, they got some more questions on the defensive side of the ball, as far as places that they got to fill in, how they're going to look this upcoming season. Whereas the Steelers really don't. Their one question, again, that we've addressed a lot on the show, is linebacker on defense. I think that the defense it's fine. They're going to hold up. They're going to have a great season. But how far the Steelers actually go this year, I think it'll be up to, one, can the defense dominate the way I think they can? If they dominate, it sets the offense up with the opportunity to get them across the finish line and make them a playoff team again. And who knows, maybe even get a playoff win or two to get them there. I think that is very much within their reach. As we've talked about, I predict this team can win 11, maybe even 12 games this season, as long as the right guys stay healthy and they pull off some more late game heroics this year, the way they did at the end of last year. But I want to take a closer look at comparing some of the youth movement here on the Steelers compared to some of the teams that are listed ahead of them on this ESPN rankings list, just to give you a little bit more perspective as far as why I think that the Steelers are in a really good place, if they actually are. Again, this is just ESPN's rankings. It's just their research. It doesn't guarantee that that's the case, but let's take them for their word, and let's say, like, legitimately they are the 14th best roster as it stands in the NFL right now. I really think that if these guys step up and we look at some of these other teams, you're going to see why I think they can climb this ladder a little bit faster than other people might give them credit for. We'll talk about that in here on the Locked On Steelers in a moment. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Stick with us. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're going to continue this discussion here. Now, let's go over the teams that were ranked ahead of the Steelers here. And some of these, if you're a Steelers fan, you might be like booing into your phone or your radio, however you listen to your podcast, or if your computer screen, if you're watching on YouTube. But number 13 was the Denver Broncos with Russell Wilson. And that was one that kind of caught me off guard in the sense that, like, man, they did really rough last year. But then when you sit back and you think about it, I do like a lot of the Broncos roster. It's Russell Wilson, though he was bad last year, is a talented quarterback. And you've got Javonte Williams, who I like at running back, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Tim Patrick, all at wide receiver. I like some of their offensive linemen and McGlinchey and Miners and Cushenberry. And then you look on the defensive side of the ball, they've added Frank Clark. They've got Randy Gregory. Josie Jules is a solid linebacker in the middle, but their strength is going to come in the secondary, where they have Pat Surtain, Damari Mathis, and Kawan Williams, Justin Simmons, and Kareem Jackson. That is a nasty secondary. And so I get why the Broncos are given some respect there, along with their veteran quarterback. But work your way up this list a little bit more. The Seahawks listed at 12 with Geno Smith in that offense. And then, of course, the defense that has Tariq Woolen, Jamal Adams, Quandre Diggs, guys like that. And, of course, Devin Witherspoon, who they drafted early this year. Then after them, we have the Ravens at 11. And the Ravens are a team that I get it. They still have Lamar Jackson. They still have a lot of key players on defense, Roquan Smith, Patrick Queen, Marlon Humphrey. But I got some questions about how they're going to be completely put together. Can their offensive line continue to hold up? How will with the new offensive coordinator, will their passing offense flourish, or will they be similar to they've been year before, even with the additions of Odell Beckham Jr. and Zay Flowers to their receiving core? But again, I get the Ravens. They've had success as long as Lamar Jackson's healthy. I do think that they are a playoff team, even if the Steelers are in the playoffs with them. Number 10 is when it starts to get interesting, because that's where the Jets fall, and that's with Aaron Rodgers. And you kind of get the feel like, yeah, there's upside with the whole Aaron Rodgers thing, because he's going to be in a new system, new team, and they've got a lot of young playmakers on the team, like Garrett Wilson. They added Mecole Hardman and Alan Lazard to the receiving core. But man, and the defense, I think, is the big thing there. When you look at guys like Quinnen Williams on that defense, C.J. Mosley at linebacker, Sauce Gardner at corner, Jordan Whitehead and Adrian Amos at the safety positions. I like some of the names there, but man, I'm not so sure that Aaron Rodgers, if he's going to be able to just hop up in there and do all the amazing things that he did over a career span at Green Bay. But again, this is ESPN's list. We'll just stick with that. Number 9 is the Cleveland Browns, and this is something that I am against the grain as far as I think the national media on the Cleveland Browns. I don't see it. This was a team that last year they had their players, and Deshaun Watson was suspended for part of the year for those reasons. And when he came back, and I get that he needs time to gel with his new team. But when he came back, it still didn't look impressive. The Steelers still mopped them up 28-14 in the regular season finale, in a game where if the Browns knew if they won, they'd officially eliminate the Steelers' postseason chances, and they would have given the Steelers their first losing season since 2003. Like, they wanted to win that game, but they couldn't, because the Steelers outplayed them. And this is a Browns roster where a lot of things are going to be the same there. I'm not so sure that they're going to be too great that they've added Zadarius Smith instead of Jadeveon Clowney at edge rusher. But I honestly, Juan Thornhill has joined the safety group. But I honestly look at this group and I think, like, man, like, they're going to have to hope Deshaun Watson just turns back into an all-pro quarterback right away, because if he doesn't, I think that they're in for a rough one, because they didn't even get a chance to pick until I think it was the late 3rd round. But yeah, Browns at 9. That's right. That's one that I kind of scratch my head at there, because I think that we've kind of seen that roster, and they're not looking all that new this year compared to the roster that we've seen. The 49ers come in at 8, and that just goes to show you how strong the AFC is, that the 49ers were in the NFC Championship last year. There's a lot of hope that they're going to be able to even make another step up, maybe even make a Super Bowl appearance run this year. And they're the 8th team on this list, because so many AFC teams are higher above them. And you look at that roster, I get it. The defense is phenomenal. They're going to be tough, but the question will be at quarterback. What's going on with Brock Purdy? What's going on with Trey Lance? How will that be divvied up? Christian McCaffrey, Deebo Samuel, George Kittle, all key playmakers in that offense. Number 7 was the Chargers, Justin Herbert. I have this thing about the Chargers, though. Anytime anyone ever tells me the Chargers are going to be some super squad, they always fall flat on their face. And this goes back to the Drew Brees, LaDainian Tomlinson days. That's right. Not even the Phillip Rivers, LaDainian Tomlinson days, but the Drew Brees, LaDainian Tomlinson days. And there might be some younger fans out there that might be like, Drew Brees was a Charger? Yes, he was. That's how far back this stretches. But people have been trying to sell me on the Chargers back from their San Diego days. That they're gonna be this thing. They're 7 here. I'll believe it when I see it as far as that. But again, roster construction, not how they'll actually finish this year. That's what this list is about. Number 6 is the Dallas Cowboys, which I get. They have a really good offensive line. They've got Dak Prescott, Tony Pollard, CeeDee Lamb. They've got playmakers. Their defense is led by Micah Parsons, DeMarcus Lawrence. They've got playmakers there. I understand the Cowboys being there. Number 5 is where the Bengals come in, and that's the top AFC North team on this list, and I get it. The Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd. That is a 5-headed monster on offense, and I totally understand that. Question about their offensive line, but their defense has held up very well over the past years. They got some questions to do with safety, though, because they lost both their guys there. But I think that's still it's very reasonable, more than reasonable, to put the Bengals in the top 5 there as far as roster construction. But ahead of them is a very interesting team, and that's the Miami Dolphins at 4. And I get it. They've added some key players there. Bradley Chubb's still, going to be the edge rusher. They've added Jalen Ramsey to Xavier Howard, and maybe that's a big part of this, is that might be the best 1-2 cornerback punch in the NFL this upcoming season. You still have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle as your top receivers for Tua Tagovailoa to throw to. There's a lot of strength there to like about it, but I still got to see the Dolphins put it together. They're an organization it also falls flat on their face a lot. Number 3 is the Bills, and a team that I really think that this is like the last chance that Josh Allen might have with the full gamut of the crew that they've assembled here with guys like Stephon Diggs to make it here. But they're still a really talented bunch. They still got Leonard Floyd, Von Miller, Ed Oliver, Daquan Jones on the defensive front, Tre'Davious White in the secondary. And then again, Allen has Diggs, Davis. They've added Dalton Kincaid with Dawson Knox at the tight end position. I think that they're in a great spot. The Eagles come in at number 2, which makes sense with them just making a Super Bowl appearance and then bringing back a lot of the guys from there. But now they've added a running back in DeAndre Swift. I get why the Eagles there. And of course, number 1 is the Kansas City Chiefs. But here's where I think the Steelers can grow here. Now, I'm not going to just say the Steelers are just going to jump up and they'll be top 5 and, start playing renegade right now, Steelers fans. But I am going to say, I think they're a team that if you're looking at some of these rosters that are ahead of them, I think they can be better than the Broncos if their offense improves. And again, their offense doesn't have to improve to be a top 10 offense this year. We're just talking about them getting out of the 20s, which they've been in 3 of the last 4 years. They ranked 26th in scoring, 23rd in yards last year. And if they can get up into the mid-teens, you're going to see such a difference in some of these games and how they play out. I really think that people underestimate just how big of a jump that can be if they go from being on the back end of the league to the middle part of the league. And that's again, being very reasonable with expectations. Kenny Pickett not being a Pro Bowl quarterback or anything like that, just him taking natural gradual steps to be a better quarterback. With George Pickens being a slightly better receiver, Najee Harris getting more comfortable in the run game. Not saying anyone's going to turn into a superstar overnight, but they take those natural steps that I think are next in all of their careers where they're at for the Pittsburgh Steelers. That gets you to this point. And again, I look at how last year worked, but the Steelers, they ranked in the 20s with scoring, and when you look at where they were, the Steelers ranked 26th in scoring. They averaged 18.1 points per game. If they're able to get to 16, the Giants at 16 were 21.5. So we're talking about a little bit more than a field goal difference as far as how many more points they can score. And ask yourself right now, Do you think that a better Kenny Pickett, a better offensive line, better Najee Harris, Pat Freiermuth, George Pickens, Deontay, if that group takes a step forward, do you really think it's just a field goal better per game that they could actually be better? Could it be a touchdown, 5 points, 6 points on average per game? They could score more. If they're scoring 6 points per game, that does make them a top 10 offense, because that would put them just ahead of the Seattle Seahawks, who ranked 9th with 23.9 points per game last year. But again, even if it's just 4 points, let's say that would put them just above where the Packers were last year at 14. The Packers did miss the playoffs, but they also didn't have the defense that the Steelers are bringing them with this year, which again is the strongest point of the team. This again is why I'm hammering home. Buy in on what the Steelers are doing this year. I'm not saying they're Super Bowl contenders, but even with a modest ranking of 14th overall as far as how their roster is constructed, this is a year where there's a lot of growth potential here. And if one thing hits, I think one thing hits right for them as far as all the things that could go right for them on offense, it puts them in a better position. But if multiple things hit, man, we could be talking about a drastically different type of Steelers team that is knocking heads and is being a big problem, a big contender that people are talking about in December and January a lot more than just being a team that hopes to sneak in the wild card. But there's a lot more time to talk about that. I want to talk more about this offense as we get further throughout this offseason. We're only a few weeks away from training camp. We'll have all the coverage there from St. Vincent College, so stick with us there. Again, I'm your host, Chris Carter of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks so much for checking us out on this Wednesday episode here, which you can find on all your podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of your daily Monday to Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. If you want to help us out, go on Apple Podcasts, rate us 5 stars with a positive comment. Do both at the same time. You get a special shout out at the end of the show. Thanks again to everybody. We'll be back Thursday with more here on the Locked On Steelers podcast right here, talking on your Pittsburgh Steelers.